Hello, good afternoon. Before we go, let me introduce you to our viewers.
Okay.
You are a hospice physician, palliative care physician, and the CEO and the Chief Medical Officer of Hospice and Palliative Care Buffalo in New York State. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. Which is a large care organization, I gather. It's looking after up to 1,000 palliative care patients a day. And you're also an end-of-life researcher.
Mm-hmm. Well,
And
I'm a PhD in neurobiology
yeah,
who veered into this somehow.
well, I was going to ask you about that PhD, but you're also the author of Death is But a Dream, Finding Hope and Meaning at Life's End.
Yeah.
Because about 10 years ago, you started a new or unique research project in this field. You decided with your research team to directly ask your hospice patients about their experiences, about their dreams and visions during the time close to death.
Yes.
So the months and weeks and sometimes days leading up to their death.
Exactly.
And that was published in scientific papers and studies. You've been in the media a lot. So before we want to get into the experiences of your patients, I wanted to ask you, how did you become a hospice doctor?
Uh, completely by accident. I actually petitioned to get out of the rotation as a resident. And I was very interested in acute medicine and actually uncomfortable with this whole notion of dying. And I came to Buffalo because it's close to my home in Toronto to be a fellow in cardiology. And I needed to support my family and saw a want ad in the paper for a hospice doctor on weekends. I wasn't sure what that was. And so anyways, I started doing it on the side. And after a few months, I realized this was the most meaningful thing I'd ever done as a physician. And that even though I was ill-trained and ill-equipped, it made sense to me. And it was something about being allowed to have protected time and space with people, to know them, their families, and found out there was an enormous amount to do, including being present. And there was just, I've never looked back, I guess 20 some odd years later.
What inspired you and your team to get involved with the research and asking
Ra-
your patients?
Probably rage, frustration. I was very active in teaching medical students, interns, residents. And I came into this work completely unfamiliar with the experiential side of dying. And it was really my colleagues and other disciplines who kind of brought me reluctantly to the bedside. It's not something I was predisposed to as an interest at all. But I recognized that it was enormously therapeutic for the patient and their family, and it had validity in those terms. But when I tried to teach it, the retort or rebuttal that I constantly received was, well, there was no evidence for it. And we're going to see it as believe it evidentiary time period of learning, unfortunately. And so we did the studies initially really just to prove the case and speak in the language that doctors like. So using validated instruments, ruling out for confusion, looking at med lists. We did it longitudinally. We used validated instruments. We even filmed people. And of course, the great irony of this is we published 8 papers, which has gotten not a ton of attention from the medical community. They get published, but of course, it's gone around the world in major media and in multiple countries and languages. So there's something fascinating in the disconnect and the interest between the people who we trust to provide the care and the people who are the recipients of our care. This matters to patients at the end of their life, and it matters to their families.
Yeah. Talking about the doctors and the medical profession, why do you think there wasn't such a great response from them?
Well, I think it's undeniable that we've lost our way with dying as a profession and as a society. We're more death defying. I think our care is fragmented so that we're more organ system based and we don't treat people in totality. We talk about comprehensive care, but we don't really deliver it in that form. I think there's this sense that we define our purpose as the act of doing to somebody rather than, and we say the worst things we can say to somebody is there's nothing more we can do for you, which is really means there's nothing more we can do to you, as opposed to just being present. And so it's a form of abandonment, and this notion that we've seemed to have lost that you cure where possible, but you comfort always, is no longer true. Even our whole, particularly in the West, our whole healthcare economy is built on the doing of things. And that's why when you start to die and you're no longer considered curable or treatable, you fall off a cliff. And you can get, $1 million care the year preceding, but when you actually start to die, if there's not hospice, there's not a lot of care for you. So the systems are built that way. We're educating around that way. We've allowed ourselves to become more comfortable with this idea of letting people go. And society plays a role. We're ageist. There's always something you can do to defeat it. And all of it together. And we've lost our way.
But the general population, the response was much greater. Do you think there are issues which need to be addressed? And that's what people are feeling. And that's why there was such a response to it.
Well, I think it's a couple of things. One is so many people had these experiences and they needed a clinical context or framework to understand. That's a lot of the response I get, is that, I've witnessed this. I didn't understand it. Thank you. So that's part of it. I also think we're seeing a cultural shift. This is true in the publishing world. 15 years ago, you couldn't get a book published with the word death in it. And now, there's death cafes and the TED Talks work and books work. I think as the baby boomers age, they don't want the doctor's death and they want to say about their end of life. So I think we're seeing a heightened conversation in and around these topic areas.
You touched upon it earlier, and you said one of the biggest critiques probably are that these are just dreams, hallucinations, at worst states of delirium. What can you say to that?
All not true. And that's why filming the patients became so vital. First of all, these are university approved studies and you can't be confused or confounded to participate. You can't be demented. We use screens for those things every time we interview somebody. We would check labs, rule out infection. People are cognitively intact. In fact, they have heightened acuity, if anything. So the confusion question, if somebody does become confused, they're out. I think what gets lost is the vantage point. Most people going from living to death have mental status changes, particularly in the last days, maybe hours, minutes of life. That's a thing. It's true. Delirium is horribly common. But what we're talking about is not those moments. We're going upstream, sometimes by many months. So these are people who are highly functional, many independent, driving their cars, paying their taxes. So these are not people who are gasping for air at the end of life. So that's, and I, really to see them is really important because they make their own case the best. In terms of it being dreams, and this is where we get into trouble because the only nomenclature we have is dreams or visions. And yet the thing we hear most commonly is no, these aren't like dreams, or I don't normally dream. And when we measure realism on a 0 to 10 scale, It's usually around 10. So these feel virtual or lived. One explanation is that sleep architecture changes in illness. You sleep more in and out of sleep states. So one of the thoughts is perhaps people are lucid dreaming. And in fact, in one study, they said they were awake as much as they were asleep for these experiences. So we don't have an explanation for it, but we still use the terms dreams because that's our only reference point.
Mm-hmm. And is there a distinction between visions and dreams?
Yeah, I mean, theoretically, when you're awake for, when you're not, we don't see a qualitative distinction. They still feel as virtual either way. And they both bleed into full wake state, so they feel like happenings. And it really is the most common thing we hear from our patients is that, I think that's really one of the reasons why it has such profound effects on them, is that it doesn't feel separate too. It feels lived in.
And what are the effects on the patients?
Well, the vast majority, near 90%, have a very comforting and meaningful experience. These tend to be restorative dreams where they're reunited with people who they've loved and lost, very specific people, the people who secured or loved them best. If there's a need for forgiveness or reunion, a wound of some sort, it often is addressed. Survivor's guilt from a war, that sort of thing. We see those sort of things happening. We did a very interesting study where we looked at the dying process as post-traumatic growth. So dying being the trauma, and yet could there be positive psychological gains? And what we found that was fascinating is people who were having these experiences were actually gaining insight and understanding right up until the very end. So there's this kind of odd paradox to dying where you're physically clearly lessening and declining, but psychologically or spiritually, you're gaining and you're changing right up until the very end. So when you ask what is the impact of this, it's many things. It changes your perception. It changes how you're feeling. It lessens the fear of dying, certainly. It provides you understanding and insight that you might not have had. So mostly, I think it gives you this sense of wholeness that you're returned to, because time seems to be less relevant. So if you lost that parent in childhood, you sense their presence and their love again. So it's very, very restorative, or this idea of being put back together.
And in practical terms, what would be a different approach than in hospice work or in hospitals or in palliative care in general?
Well, I mean, dying is inherently isolating and made more so by not at least having some degree of reverence that the person has a different vantage point and not surprisingly has different perceptions or perception, and that should at least be respected, that dying is really less of a physical phenomenon. It's pretty anticlimactic. But at the experiential or subjective level, something very profound is happening. And giving permission for that is important. One of the worst thing that can happen is you medicate for this and you sterilize people from their own dying process. But making them feel alone rather than saying, hey, it's very common that at this point, this is what happens. And that allows people then to at least not wonder what's happening or to be able to share it.
Mm-hmm. And the medicalizing, or are you talking about giving them heavy medication, sedation?
Yeah, we see a lot of that because it's often misinterpreted as a delirious state. And it's very, very easy to extinguish these experiences. Sometimes we do it deliberately per the patient's choice because they're so intense that they're interfering with sleep. And it's very hard to die comfortably if you can't sleep. But most people are enjoying these experiences.
And is this really very close up to death, or is this days and weeks?
We've seen, on average, we see it probably around starting about 2 weeks before death. And what happened was in our original study, where there was over 500 and something interviews, we were surprised at the number of people who were having them at the 2-week mark. So we went farther upstream, and we do capture people. And some of this is intuitive. If you in our earthly healthy concerns, we worry about taxes or bills or appointments or whatever. As you get closer to death, that change in vantage point becomes reflective and introspective. And you think about what really mattered for having lived. And those tend to center on your relationship. So we start to see that around several months away. And then it actually permeates your kind of lived state when you close your eyes and you return to these things that are very, very important.
So what are the themes that you get in the dreams and visions mostly?
Well, over a third of the people have dreams that of traveling or preparing to grow that seem very metaphoric to what's happening, even though they actually don't seem to make that connection. There's often somebody with them who they know who's almost like a guide or a presence or a reassuring comfort of some sort. Upwards of 70% see people who have died, who return to them. And interestingly, they leave out the person who harmed or had conditional love for them. So it may be one parent, but not another. So there's almost this edification process that takes place. Pets are very, very common. Religious themes are extraordinarily rare, although one interpretation is the tenets of faith are throughout the ideas of love and forgiveness. But what happens is interesting is we study this every day until death. And as people get closer to death, there's a dramatic increase in the frequency of these events. And but the content switches. So as you get closer to dying, you see more of the deceased than the living. And when you measure content and comfort, the theme that gives you the most comfort on a 0 to 5 scale is seeing the deceased. So there's like this built-in mechanism. As you get closer to dying, you're more put back to the people who you've loved and lost. And that, it turns out, gives you the greatest degree of comfort.
How do you explain that?
I don't. One of the things we've worked very hard to do is because anytime you study anything pre-death, it's naturally fodder for what happens after. And it's this kind of keyhole you're looking through, whether it goes towards paranormal, religiosity, spirituality. And what we tried very hard to do is just look at pre-death without extrapolation. And just saying, okay, well, this is a mystery unto itself. And we just wanted to translate the patient's experiences. And then we would look to obviously at the bereaved as well, and without trying to do anything else with it. So I don't have an explanation.
So you're not trying to find the answer, what will happen after death?
Not at all. Mm-mm.
And that works well?
No, because everybody wants to know.
Well, I mean, in terms of the relatives and patients, so the people concerned rather than
one of the more interesting things that this is more of an observation. If you read work on near-death experiences, people almost come back from those events with profoundly changed their personality, their choices. They relay messages of understanding. There's these great epiphanies and understandings. And the people who are actually dying who have these experiences don't do that at all. It's not a dry run, and the time for therapy is over. And I've never had a patient wake up from one of these things and say, I saw this. What do you think this metaphor means? There's no analyzing. These feel, and you can really tell in the videos, these feel like lived events. And the meaning of them seems to be intuited. They don't need to extrinsically, process it. They just, a matter of fact, happen to them. So they tend not to, they tend not to go there. It just seems to be understood. I think if I were to guess, I think they're left with feelings that they're not alone. that they're loved, they're going to be okay. And when we've looked at children, they tend to use the exact same language. They often haven't known someone who died, but they will know a pet, and they will go there and they will say, "It means I'm not going to be alone where I'm going. I'm loved. It's okay." So those are the tens. Definitely, the fear of dying seems to lessen.
I was going to ask how the children and their parents cope with the dying process, because it's one of the hardest things for a parent to see their children die. And
we've published case series on them. There's a chapter in the book about it. They do this. They do this differently. They don't have regret. They often don't have language for mortality or death or finality. But somehow they become very self-informed by these processes, even of their prognosis. They understand that they're in a terminal state. They tend to build other worlds for themselves. For example, one young lady in the book kept returning to a castle, and she's in the castle. All the animals that she knew that had died, neighbors, cats, relatives, birds, were all in there. And there was sense in there too. There was light and warmth in the swimming pool. So she created this world for herself. And when asked what it meant to her, she said it means it's a safe place. So she actually created a world where she would visit, and she kept going to that castle throughout her illness. That was her place. And that's how she reconstructed her life while dying. And knew exactly, one of the questions that I struggled with is, how do you have these conversations with children? And what I found is there was no need. They made their own conclusions from their own inner experiences.
So it's more about just being present. Do they have a need or a drive to share these experiences with you?
Yes, and probably the biggest difference with the children is that it's so unedited. It just flows. And there's one young lady in the film who's fascinating. So her fear was, who was she, or how does she live without her mother? She was raised by a single parent. And her mother's dear friend had died years earlier. And so one day she sees her mother's friend in her mother's room playing with her drapes. And again, the words came out, I'm not going to be alone. So again, we see this where the thing that was needed most was this maternal figure in her existence, in her conscious, and that's what came to her. And it was interesting in that case, she didn't want to say anything because she didn't want to upset her mother. So she was protecting her own parent from her own eventual death. But she was fully aware. And she was 13.
And how did the parents react? How did they?
We've done a lot of work with that. We've published some of that. And remarkably positive. Because I think a couple of things. We all, when we're looking down at someone we love who's in a bed dying, the question that we're all brought to is, where are they when their eyes are closed? Are they okay? We talk a lot about physical comfort, which is actually relatively easy to achieve and mostly takes care of itself. But where are they? Is this emptiness? Are they in distress, just non-exhibiting? And we've done 2 studies on bereaved of over 750 bereaved people. And it's fascinating. Basically, what's good for the patient is good for their loved one. And when we've used actual validated measures of grief and bereavement processing, what we have found is that these experiences actually enormously help them. Often, they're connected to that patient's experience. So let's say the couple lost a child, decades earlier. And the life partner is lying in the bed and holding or talking to that child. That completely recontextualizes the loss of the partner. So they're not drifting to emptiness, they're actually reacquainted with familiar love. So how people die, it turns out, and not surprisingly, very much affects how we process loss and how we remember them. And so these experiences have really profound implications for how we bereave. In the children's cases, even more so. The children lived with this awareness of these experiences so openly that they became shared. And the parents, it became an undeniable reality that their children was having a different inner experience. And it wasn't brought up to question. It was just, this is. And the one mother is on the video, and she goes on about how much it's changed her sense of loss, that this is what she now believes. So yeah, it matters.
How willing were the patients to get involved with
that? That is actually that is a story in itself, because one of our problems with dying is we treat it with such sanctity that we sterilize the dying, not to be disturbed. And so it's very hard to get the university to approve these studies. And I think this is one of the most fascinating things, is that not a single person ever approached, denied wanting to be involved. And what's interesting is they're often sharing the hard parts of having lived some really rough stuff, the unvarnished truth of their lives. And I think it's a really hopeful story. Is there's no secondary gain for them. I think what it tells us that people don't stop living because they're dying. They want to be relevant. They want to be connected. They want their voices heard. They want to be listened to. And it's a real lesson that most people who are dying are looking up at a white ceiling, and they would rather be looking into somebody's eyes, even if they're a stranger, and telling them their story. And the other thing interesting is nobody wanted their name changed.
When they were being filmed.
Yeah, and in the book, that's who they are, and it's just the truth that they told. I think it was liberating. They very matter of every so often you'd have an older woman who says, okay, I don't mind being filmed, but I just want a chance to do my hair. But other than that, people, I think they don't, all the pretense is gone.
Do you think you've caught a representative part of the population, or is there some kind of bias in terms of the people you have been interviewing?
I think there's a tremendous bias. There's several that are very, very important. One is that we're dealing with the hospice population, so that means that they have awareness of their own mortality, and they've signed into a program that is built in and around their terminality. So that's one thing. I actually don't think that makes much of a difference. The other thing we're obviously missing is acute death, which is unanticipated or sudden or traumatic loss, which is about 10%. But there's some interesting observations. When George Floyd, do you know who he is?
Yeah.
When the police were killing him,
the guy with the police.
He did what people often did. He's calling out to his mother. That's the last thing he said, screaming for his mom. Expressions like "my life passed before my eyes." I don't know how you study it, but yeah. So there are biases. Yeah. And I think we underrepresent obviously certain minority groups, faith-based groups. But interestingly, the more ancient cultures and civilizations and belief systems, actually, this is more baked into their collective thinking. You know, it's often a way to maintain your ancestral ties, is that you are connected and the dead do return to you and that sort of thing.
Yeah. I work as a general practitioner myself, and I probably get the other side of, or the other bias of the population, which is those people and families which struggle. Pain is one matter, but it's you do often hear the stories about somebody hallucinating or seeing something, and I get the impression generally the family is disturbed by this.
Yeah. I actually think it's a terrific observation. And by the way, I think there is a gray zone. Delirium is so common at the end of life. I think that you can be both delirious and having these experiences, actually, and it's hard to sort out. Changes in mind function by family members is viewed as dehumanizing or depersonalizing. So it's automatically upsetting to the family to see somebody undignified by something like that. In these processes, what we find is that once you make them aware, it's fascinating how it brings them closer to the bedside. So I had somebody not too long ago who, you know, going in the morning and the daughter's sitting in the corner of the room because her mother's reverted to her native Polish language. And she's, you know, clearly in and out of sleep, but making all these references. And explain to the daughter, this is really very common, et cetera, et cetera. And I come in the next day and she's by the bedside making notes, and she's learning about all of her mother's childhood friends, her pets, the grandparents she didn't know. So I think it's one of our clinical roles is to palliate a lot of things, including the discomfiture for the family around things they might not quite be sure of how to interpret. So yeah, I've seen that.
I found interesting in your book, you say that not all the dreams are actually pleasant.
No, you die as you live, particularly if you've been traumatized, it comes back. We made a very big mistake in our early work as we labeled them as comforting, neither, or distressing. And about 13% or so are truly listed as distressed. But those are often the most transformational or end up being some of the most meaningful. I'll give you an example. So a mother is questioning her identity as a mother because she had a child who had drug addiction, ended up in prison with related crimes, and kept going kind of back to that central core identity. And then in her end of life experiences, her parents come to her who were deceased, acknowledged this, but said she was a very good mom. The war veteran is probably the best example, who for 67 years had PTSD and was having horrific reliving of D-Day. And the people, he was on a craft that was bringing people from the shore. But then he had a dream where the soldiers came to him and said, we're coming for you now. And he got to relive the day he got his discharge papers. So these experiences don't deny the trauma, but they almost transcend it and take it somewhere else. And after that, he was able to sleep and die peacefully. So, yeah, we don't see people just suffering horrors for the sake of the horror. It tends to have value to it.
I remember, I think, two stories which were in the book back to back. This was I think the policeman, and then there was somebody else who was
Dwayne.
I think he had a throat cancer in the end. Yeah.
He had actually killed two people in self-defense on the street.
That wasn't in the book, I don't think.
And what he felt was being stabbed at the site of his cancer. That's actually that whole thing is on film.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because we were interviewing him. He hadn't told us any of this, and he was very lighthearted. And then we said, are there any other dreams? And all of a sudden he just completely decompensated on film and told the story of being stabbed. But what happened was, he's one of these guys who couldn't afford to look back. He just kind of, he was always joking and lighthearted, but he woke up and he asked to see a daughter, and he asked for forgiveness and told her how much he loved her after having these dreams. So for the first time, he talked of a life that included regret. Again, transformative. It couldn't have had a bigger impact. And the daughter's also on film, talking about what it meant for her to see that change in him.
Yeah. This is the documentary that...
There's been two things that have been done. One is a Netflix special called Surviving Death. And it was went around the world, and we were in episode 5. And then there's a separate PBS documentary called Death is But a Dream, which is aired on the World Channel and PBS, and it comes out periodically. But people can also look at some of these videos through our website, which is Dr. Christopher Kerr, KERR.com. Mm-hmm. Because I really encourage it, because I just can't do justice to the actual videos of the patient. The Surviving Death series is accessible, though, through Netflix. And again, if it's on episode 5 that you'll see our work.
You mentioned it, but I want to bring it up still, because one of the chapters entitled is "We Die as We Live." How true is that saying?
Oh, it's very true. It's the inescapable truth, is that it is the realities that we lived with aren't denied at the end. But it doesn't feel like punishment. We don't see that. So we don't see people categorized as necessarily evil. They have done evil things, and those things aren't denied, but there's more dignity than that, it seems like.
Do you have any examples of people experiencing that?
Yeah, I think there was a woman who was institutionalized from childhood and taken out of her home. And this was an institution that actually ended up being closed because of all the abuses that had taken place. But she had never learned to love. And she even said, I see people kissing on the television show and I don't understand it. And men for her were objects to be used, but she didn't truly feel in the core. And so a lot in her end of life experience, what she would see herself flying above people, but not interacting with them. But there was one man who had told her that he actually loved her towards the end of her life, but she didn't believe him. But then at the end, he comes to her and she sees him at the end of her bed, and she realizes for the first time the experience of love. So her dying process was consistent with who she was and how she lived. It was cold, it was alone, without any human connection. But then there's something redemptive happens, that she's showing love in a final form of some sort. And she felt she knew it for the first time.
What I gathered from your book, one of the overriding themes is love.
Yes. I think that, and that was certainly not a hypothesis or anything we had. I think what we get wrong about dying is that, again, it's life closure, and that is defined really by our relationships. And so, as Carrie Egan wrote, kind of our first and our last church and classroom is family, and that's where we're showing love, and that's what we return to. but they're all relationship based in the end. And again, what's so fascinating is a number of times that the people who withheld love are just not included.
They're the ones who in the particular person who withheld love. So the ones who disappointed them.
Yeah. So, you know, there was a wonderful story, and she's on film as well. She had she lived in Cleveland, Ohio, and had a German mother who was demanding and cruel and never nurturing, never touched her, never said, "I love you." She had this wonderful Irish father who loved music and dance. And she had two lives. He was a mailman, and in the home, he was humorless and cold. But when she was finished with church, she was allowed to go through the clearing in the woods, meet her father, and finish his route with him hand in hand, and they'd sing songs. And so in her end of life, she kept going to the clearing in the woods, and her father would hold her hand and they'd walk. Never saw her mother. So there was a man who had lost an arm as a child, and two of his 7 siblings teased him mercilessly about his injury. He sees the other 5 brothers repeatedly throughout his end-of-life processes, and the other 2 never show up. And interestingly, his injury was more psychogenic in that, you know, it happened at an age during the industrial age. What am I going to do? How am I going to be independent and of worth? And at his final dreams, everybody he worked with came by his bed in his dream and told him how he was better at his job than anybody else. So, and this is the other common theme, is that whatever seems to be your lesion seems to be somehow be addressed. So.
And do you think, is that just a soothing dream to allow the person to be comfortable, to find peace, or do you think there's truth in that as well? So
I'm not a believer that I don't know what they are, but that they're dreams. They're certainly not dreams in the sense that we reference them. And I say that for a few reasons. If we're to listen to our patients, what they're saying is, no, these aren't dreams, or I don't normally dream, or no, this I was involved in. And there's videos of people, for example, who come out of these experiences and they had a family meal, who have the sensation of feeling full when they're feeling full, like they ate. So yeah. They're not talked about as though they were distant happenings, but that they were participatory. And that's one of the reasons why the effect bleeds into wakefulness, so much so. And why they're measurably changed, as you can measure. Dreams don't have that effect. They also don't have all the metaphorical complications, symbolic stuff that dreams does, that are strange, that we can look at and go, well, that's strange, and I wonder what that means. People don't come out of these experiences going, you know, so I saw a white bird and I'm not quite sure the white bird symbolized maybe this. It just doesn't happen that way. They're not left with questions, they're left with answers. And that's a big distinction between dreams, because most of us come out of dreams trying to decipher. Mm-hmm. And these people just emerge with understanding. So if they are dreams, they're different. You know.
So there's much less to interpret there, rather to just experience.
Yes. Yeah. I honestly have never had somebody ask me, or say, I had the weirdest dream and I'm not sure what this means. It just is.
One of your chapters is the child's language of death. Is the child's language of death different from those of adults?
Yeah, in ways that I described. So they don't have the same reference points. They may not have known somebody who died, and they don't talk about mortality in the same way. They live in the present. They don't carry regret from the life that they led. There's lots they don't understand about what's happening to them, but in a way they seem to understand more so that they're going to be okay. They do this very colorfully, very creatively, and they indulge it differently. They're very transparent in what these experiences are for them.
Yeah, I remember one girl, her name Ginny?
Yes. Yeah. She's somebody who did have a very religious uh, themed dream, which was fascinating. Her mother had a baby monitor, and on the Monday before she died on a Friday, and the Monday before, her mother heard her on the baby monitor and said, went into the room and said, what do you want? She goes, oh, I don't want anything. She goes, well, I keep hearing you on the baby monitor. And she goes, well, I'm not talking to you. She goes, I'm talking to God. And described him as a good-looking old man. And she had never been to church or baptized. It wasn't a religious family at all. But that she said it's okay. And then we were out and filmed actually right immediately afterwards, and she never woke again, and she died at the end of that week. And her mother is very clear she's on film. So when you ask, what's the effect of this for the parents? For her, it was profoundly meaningful. And she wasn't religious at all.
Mm-hmm. So are you taking this work to other doctors, educational institutions? What's going to happen?
I am not optimistic on going the physician route. There are doctors who know this in their bones, and there'll be an oncologist pop up, and he lives it all the time. If you find a doctor who this is relatable to them, it's usually based on a personal experience rather than a professional one. I find nurses to be entirely different. The closer you are to actually providing care, the more this is understood. I think the real value is that it is for the non-medical world, the people who are experiencing illness or their caregivers. They're the ones who at least open their minds and their hearts to this. And I think we have some evidence that it's working. So I think that's where it belongs.
Yeah. In your film, I think you describe how you actually learned from the nurses first and started to realize there's something going on that is worthwhile.
Yeah, what actually, I learned from the nurses, the chaplains, and the social workers, not the physicians. As what started off was they were able to prognosticate better than I could. Mm-hmm. Because when they knew that somebody was seeing the dead, that had significance. And actually, that's what the study bore out when we followed people longitudinally, that there was a predictive piece to this. So it was really the old time nurses who knew. And in fact, some of the best referrals we've gotten from our studies were actually nurses' aides, people who were at the bedside providing care. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. In your book, you also, and in the films, I guess you mentioned your father who died when you were young, who was also a doctor. Did that shape your life, your career?
I would have said that it drove me away from anything to do with death, which I think it did for the most part. And it was something I wasn't even comfortable talking about. But then I end up full circle doing this sort of work. And the last time I saw him, he was having one of these experiences. So, you're at a level, I guess I don't understand. There isn't a coincidence, but it certainly wasn't done deliberatively. In fact, my intention and my efforts were to go towards the interventional side of medicine with interventional cardiology, not end up doing this. But mm-hmm. This is where I found meaning.
Mm-hmm. So, yeah. And were you disillusioned with cardiology that you?
Yeah, I was certainly becoming disillusioned with the practice of medicine in that that I could feel the dissatisfaction, the frustration of practitioners who were spending more than 50% of their time not doing direct care, but documentation or phoning insurance companies. I was certainly saddened to see all the time constraints that you couldn't actually know people. or if somebody came into your office and said they were depressed, you immediately worried because you had to get out in 15 minutes. So all of those constraints that were diluting the impulses, the good impulses that brought us to medicine, there were a lot of factors working against us. So to come into a model of practice that didn't measure our value in units of productivity, but in terms of what the outcome meant for the people we were serving, was really utopic for me, and caught me right at the right time before I was completely disillusioned and frustrated. So yeah, I've never looked back.
So do you have much more time with your patients?
Oh my gosh, yeah. And with their families, and you're seeing them in their home. And I feel we are treating them in totality, and I'm treating them with my partners in other disciplines, who I think together we can be so much more impactful, and it actually works. The model works.
How large is your research team? Are you still carrying on with this work? Do you have plans for the future?
We do all sorts. It's funny, we're known for this, but we do drug studies. We look at programmatic studies. We're doing a lot on caregiving and a lot on forgiveness. So we're all over the place. There's usually 3 other people full-time plus some students, and which is very unique for a hospice to do. But years ago, I knew that we were doing some very interesting clinical work therapeutically, we were practicing in islands, and it wasn't shared within the mainstream, using drugs like ketamine, for example, and Ritalin, and all these sorts. So we started publishing that. And again, this work just grew out of frustration trying to teach the meaning of the patient's experience. So it's been fun doing it.
So you always been doing this for some time. I think you started research 10 years back.
No, I started research in early 2000s. This research on dreams and visions about 10 years ago.
What did you do before?
I did quite a few drug studies. I did programmatic studies, like outcome studies of palliative care in hospitals, outcome studies of palliative care in the home, outcome studies of palliative care in prisons. So whatever just seemed interesting, we studied, and I enjoyed writing. I knew we had great stories to tell, and it seemed a shame that we weren't sharing any of it. And because in this country, hospice isn't standardized. It's practiced different by every community. It's all self-invented, and so there's no universal anything here. And so it was a real opportunity to say, well, if we're going to do something, let's make sure we also feel an obligation to disseminate the information.
I should have asked you that at the beginning. You have a PhD in neurobiology, which is it's a side branch of neurosciences.
It's a specific area of neuroscience.
The studies you mentioned 2 things: caregiving and forgiveness. Is that correct? How can I imagine that being done and organized?
Yeah, there's some actual training programs on forgiveness therapy. So how to construct a forgiveness interaction between people, and then measuring the outcome and what it provides them in terms of comfort or relief. There's dignity therapy, so how to pass on, almost like a living eulogy, what your memories and what you value, what you've learned. Wisdom therapy. There's all sorts of other aspects that, again, take dying from an organ-based approach to really treating the person, and all of these therapies kind of allow for it. These are things that matter, and it pulls the loved one in. Doing some very interesting work looking at caregiving, which is normally described in terms of burnout and stress and but doesn't acknowledge all
for the carers,
for the caregiver, yeah, but it doesn't doesn't acknowledge the gratitude. So I just interviewed a family with a dying child, and they view it as the greatest blessing in their life. And they describe it in wonderful ways, and including their community, their refugee family. And so to try to tell that story is interesting. So kind of all over the place.
Perhaps just finally, in terms of the numbers, you said up to 90% have these dreams and visions.
Yep.
So it's quite common, actually.
Yeah, and so I think it's probably 30% higher than anything previously reported. But the difference was in other studies, they were episodic interactions where they'd be asking. What we did is follow people longitudinally. It's very possible the number is higher. But what happened is we had to exclude people who had, known brain-based disease, any dementia. There's actually a chapter in the book on people who are cognitively different. It's actually my favorite chapter. They weren't included in our formal studies, but they did this in the most creative, colorful, and interesting ways. Their end-of-life experiences. So often we talk about people who are cognitively different in terms of the currency by which we talk to them is their deficit, and which often ignores that the fact they have these rich emotional lives and tones and histories, and those often come to surface. There's a spectacular video of a demented woman who is euphoric in her dying days because when she closes her eyes, she's reacquainting herself with her husband, who she just adored. And in the last week of life, her daughter had to go calls the nursing home because her mom's escaping. And she's escaping because she's going to her wedding day. So they do this in there's a Down syndrome young lady who had ovarian cancer and ascites, and she was always inherently maternal and carried dolls, and this was her baby. And when she had pain, it was the baby kicking. And so they do this differently, but it has no less, even maybe more meaning for the person experiencing it. We had a fascinating one of my partners, who he's also filmed. Mother was traumatized from World War II. Her life was just changed in every imaginable way and saw horrors. And she was an angry and bitter person most of her life. And she had lost a child at 3. And as she got closer to death, she was reacquainted with the child. And when she did that, she became a nice person, a gracious person, a friendly person, kind to staff. And she was so fundamentally changed that she no longer recognized herself in the mirror. And they had to cover all reflection of her because she didn't want to see the mean old lady anymore. She was now somewhere else. So, I forgot how we got on this, but people who are cognitively different do this really in very interesting ways. They just weren't in our studies. So, but we include them in the book and in the films.
This is slightly off the topic, but have you witnessed a lot of these?
Oh yeah.
When people are often
terminal lucidity.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah. NIH is actually sponsoring a study on that. So anybody who's taking care of people at the end of life sees this, right? Is demented people who all of a sudden can recall the names of their children. Mm-hmm. I have a theory just on this that is probably wrong. I'm not so sure that what's happening is people who have end-of-life dreams and visions are so well recontextualized to whatever it is they're experiencing that they tend to recall a lot of detail that they didn't have access to. And so somebody who lost a mother 80 years ago will talk about smelling her perfume, that kind of thing. So there's a sense or consciousness awakening or heightening, just like music therapy does. You can take a demented person who's nonverbal and the right music from the 5 decades ago, and all of a sudden they can sing the chorus. I'm not so sure the context or the stimulant for this isn't dying people having these experiences and recontextualizing themselves in a way that allows them to recall, because terminal lucidity is pretty alarming to see, but it's actually very, very real. And somebody I know, because I reviewed part of the paper, showed that actually in terms of EEG activity, that there actually is this increase in activity that can't really be explained by the physical state. So I don't pretend to understand it, but it's certainly a thing clinically.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And have you seen it a lot? How
yeah,
drastic?
I have.
How impressive can it be?
It is. It's very off-putting for the family, because if you're not prepared for it and you haven't heard your mother call your name in 3 years, and all of a sudden she starts and then she dies, it has an odd sense of something being given and then taken. It's not just medical lore, it's a thing. Interesting.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you
for a very interesting, insightful look into your work.
Great questions.
I wish you all further success and that it gets out. It really seems to be something that that society needs.
Yeah, it's a different story.
Thank you.
Thank you. Very much appreciate your time and great questions.
Thank you.
Have a good day.
Bye-bye.